Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Professor Stephen Houlgate.
Thank you. Welcome.
The owl of Minerva only flies at dusk, as we know. So we are here in the good late hours of the evening to introduce Hegel's Science of Logic and your upcoming course on the logic that you gracefully are going to teach for us. I wanted to, so I know you as a professor at Warwick, and I couldn't be more thankful that I ended up at Warwick with Miguel de Bestegui, and then also with you, uh, reading the logic, which I would never have become familiar with without you and without the course, which, as I told you many times, made things more difficult for me when it came to Heidegger, because you can't once you're confronted with the logic, there's no it's still, there's no way around it. There's no way to get away from it. So I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us more broadly, what the logic is about, where it sits in Hegel's system, but also what the course will entail. And just to let you know, everyone, enrollment is now open. There will be 2 live lectures by Stephen, and also seminars, Q&A sessions where you can ask questions, etc., as you would at university. So feel free to go ahead.
Good. Well, thank you, Johannes, for this invitation. Welcome to all of you who are considering taking the course. I should just say, first of all, to Johannes, that I'm both sorry, but also really, really pleased that studying Hegel complicated your thesis somewhat. I think that shows that that you took it seriously, and I'm glad that Hegel made a difference to the study of Heidegger. Although I'm also sorry that it caused you some agony. I do appreciate that. Okay, so I've got some thoughts to deliver to you just by way of a taster, I guess, to tell you a bit about what the logic is aiming to do and some features of it. And then I'll say a little bit about what we're actually going to do in the 2 seminars. And then if you have any questions at the end, then feel free to pose them. I'm going to assume for the moment that most of you don't know much about the logic. So if this is basic, I apologize for that. So the first thing to say is, and I guess most of you will know this, is that Hegel is one of the most influential of modern philosophers. A huge influence on Kierkegaard, Marx, Gadamer, Adorno, McDowell, Brandom, as you all know. And of course, he also influenced many philosophers negatively by providing them with their main object of critique. You think of Schelling, Bertrand Russell, and Deleuze. But I think it's fair to say that Hegel's philosophy is not well understood by many of his philosophical foes, and I'm afraid by many of his philosophical friends. Hegel is perhaps best known for his phenomenology, but the core of his philosophy, as far as I'm concerned, is his logic. And I would say this is probably the least well understood part of his not very well known philosophy. I mean, possibly the philosophy of nature is even less well known. So this online course aims to help you understand what the aim of Hegel's logic is, but also I hope it will help you understand how to read certain sections of Hegel's great book without too much bewilderment. I mean, there'll be some bewilderment, that's unavoidable, I'm afraid, but I'm hoping that that through this course that you'll not only understand what's going on, but actually be able to read certain passages and make sense on your own. Now, the project of the logic is actually fairly easily stated. It's to derive the basic categories of thought from thought itself, without assuming in advance that we always already know what it is to think. Hegel agrees with Kant that all everyday experience is shot through with categories. So we say there's something on the table, or we can ask what caused such and such an event to happen, or how big is that tree? But we don't reflect always that something, cause, and size or quantity are categories that have their source in our thought, and are not simply read off empirically from our perceptual experience. Equally, we don't always realize that we can understand such categories more or less well. We're so familiar with them that we don't think that we might not fully understand what it is to be something, what it is to be a cause, or what quantity is. Indeed, not only do we not always understand these concepts fully, we can actually misunderstand them, and we can misapply them to certain objects. So we can say, for example, that the brain causes the mind to think in a certain way without necessarily reflecting that the brain and the mind might not be the kind of objects that stand in any causal relation to one another. So the task of Hegel's logic is to derive these categories of thought from thought itself, and thereby, hopefully, to understand them and their role properly. And in this project, Hegel follows both Kant and Fichte. Hegel slightly younger than they, well, quite a bit younger than Kant, but is following in their wake. Kant thought that we should derive the categories from the fact that we make judgments. So we say things like, S is P, this is that, the rose is red, or S is not P, or all S's are P, or some S's are P, or this S might be P, or this S must be P. And Kant thought that from these forms of judging, ways of judging, we can derive categories such as reality, negation, possibility, necessity, and so on. Hegel argues against Kant, however, that we can't simply assume that thought is judgment without further examination. Nor indeed can we assume, as Fichte argued, that thought is the activity of an I in relation to a not I. For Hegel, if we're going to discover the basic categories of thought without assuming that we already know how they are to be conceived, then we must begin with nothing more than what Hegel regards as the simple being of thought itself. So Hegel begins by setting aside all we usually take for granted about thought, not by rejecting it out of hand, but by suspending all our assumptions about thought to begin with. So we suspend the idea that thought is judgment or syllogistic reasoning, or that it rests on the principle of non-contradiction. And Hegel thinks that this leaves us with nothing but the bare being of thought itself. So this is somewhat like Descartes' cogito, but without the I. So if Descartes' method of doubt, leads to the certainty that I think, therefore I am, Hegel takes this one stage further and removes the I. And this leaves us with thinking, therefore being, the thought of thought itself, a sheer indeterminate being. And so the first category with which the logic begins is the category of indeterminate being. And it's important to see that as the result of this process of setting aside, suspending, abstracting from all that we normally understand thought and indeed the world to be. And that reduces thought down to bare being. As I say, the easiest way to think about this, I think, is to go through Descartes' cogito and just to go that one stage further and get rid of the I, and then what do you have left? So that's where Hegel thinks the logic can begin. And you can then situate Hegel in relation to other thinkers. So Spinoza begins with substance. Kant, in terms of his derivation of the categories, begins with judgment. Fichte begins with the activity through which the I thinks itself. Hegel begins with the thought of thought as pure indeterminate being. From this idea of, or concept of sheer indeterminate being, Hegel then sets out to derive the basic categories of thought, a project that takes him, I'm afraid, about 800 pages. Now, on my interpretation, and I have to say other interpretations are available, this is not universally shared, But what makes Hegel's logic distinctive, and what I think makes it still important and a live way of doing philosophy, is that the logic is systematically presuppositionless. So it begins from no determinate assumptions about thought, no laws of thought, no principles of thought, not even, it should be noted, dialectic. Hegel doesn't assume dialectic at the beginning. He assumes nothing systematically about thought. The logic begins with, to quote Hegel, being, pure being, without any further determination. Now, this is not to deny that there are hermeneutic, historical, and linguistic presuppositions to presuppositionless logic. So, the hermeneutic presuppositions would include, for example, the fact that in order to do the logic, one must be prepared to suspend all presuppositions. One must be interested in discovering what the categories are, interested in the project of trying to understand what it means and should mean to think. Without that hermeneutic background, then one couldn't engage in presuppositionless logic. Hegel also thinks there's a historical presupposition to presuppositionless logic, and that can be understood in two ways, I guess. First of all, Kant's idea that we live in an age of critique, an age that is meant to be critical of the principles in terms of which we think, that shouldn't just take things for granted and randomly assert this or that in philosophy and politics or whatever. And Hegel thinks, probably slightly misunderstanding Kant, if one's going to be fair, but Hegel thinks anyway, that being fully self-critical means not to take things on authority, not to take them for granted, not just to assume we know what the categories are and what thought is. And so that leads him then to the project of presuppositionless logic. The other historical presupposition is a sort of a broader one, really, which is that of modern freedom, which Hegel dates, I suppose, to the Reformation, and then he sees that gaining momentum throughout the 18th century in both philosophy and in politics and religion. We see this in Rousseau, we see it in Kant's own philosophy, we see it in the French Revolution. And again, Hegel thinks that freedom, particularly if you, let's say you start with Kant and you think of Kant's moral philosophy, freedom involves the activity of self-determination. Well, for Kant, it's more self-legislation, but in Hegel's retelling of that Kantian story, freedom involves self-determination. Again, not taking things on authority. And so not assuming the authority of formal logic, the law of non-contradiction, and so on. So again, that gets us to the same point. So there are hermeneutic presuppositions to presuppositionless logic. There are historical presuppositions. And the last one, which I think is important, is language. Hegel thinks that thinking doesn't happen behind language, it happens in language. And we've got to be able to operate with words like no, without, so and so on, in order to be able to formulate the opening idea of being, pure being, without any further determination. You've got to have some idea of what being is to begin with in order to abstract away all that we normally associate with being. And you've got to know how words like without and no operate in order to keep apart from being all the normal associations. So if we couldn't do that in language, we couldn't formulate the thought of pure being and get the logic going. Okay, so logic has presuppositions, hermeneutic, historical, and linguistic. The point is, from Hegel's point of view anyway, it has no systematic presuppositions, no presupposed principles, no method either. And that is important to bear in mind if you hear people talking about dialectical method, particularly philosophers who might think you can take dialectical method and apply it to some other object other than just pure thought.
Would there be an example?
Well, I suppose possibly Engels. I mean, without doing an injustice to Engels, dialectical materialism purports perhaps to be a dialectic. I will excuse Marx from this because I think Marx is closer to Hegel in thinking of dialectic as being immanent to the matter at hand.
Yeah.
So that's crucial. So I wouldn't so I'd keep those two possibly apart. Okay, so no presupposed method. So then that raises the question: well, how on earth does the logic proceed? How do we move from one thought to another? If there are no rules of thought to guide us, how are we to think when we consider pure being? What are we to do? What is the method of speculative logic? Well, Hegel has an answer in one passage, which goes like this. He says, we are simply to take up, aufzunehmen, what is there before us, which is pure being, while setting aside all reflections and all opinions we otherwise have. Now, this doesn't really give you a method, but it tells you what we shouldn't do. And that in turn throws light on what we should be doing. What we shouldn't be doing is bringing to bear on pure being all our own reflections and opinions. It's not supposed to be our thinking that moves the logic forward in Hegel's view. Rather, this is to quote Hegel, it can only be the nature of the content that moves itself in scientific, that's philosophical knowing. So at the start of the logic, we don't know whether being will determine itself or not. Of course, with one part of our brain, we do know this because we know that Hegel's written the whole book. But when you're thinking about what justifies the forward momentum of the logic, as far as Hegel's concerned, we've got pure being and that's it. And we can't be looking to the end of the book like you might do with a novel to see where it ends up. You can do that, but that's not going to help you moving forward. Being moves forward if being moves forward, and that's something we have to discover. So from Hegel's point of view, whatever else being proves to be besides being pure being has got to be generated by being itself. So the method that we adopt, our comportment towards pure being, has got to be that of letting pure being be what it is and determine itself as it may. So here's another quotation from Hegel. If pure being is taken as the content of pure knowing, then the latter must step back from its content, allowing it free play without determining it further. But if German, ihn für sich selbst gewähren zu lassen und nicht weiter zu bestimmen. Now, unlike Heidegger, Hegel's not often thought of as someone who equates true thinking with letting. Yet at various places in his work, he emphasizes that speculative thought lets its subject matter hold sway or have free play. And he emphasizes this in the logic and in the phenomenology. So here's a passage from Hegel's Encyclopedia Logic. That's the shorter version of the logic. He says, when I think, I give up my subjective particularity, sink myself in the matter, let thought follow its own course, das Denken für sich gewähren lassen. And I think badly whenever I think something of my own. Now that's really kind of at odds with what modern educational theory tells us. You know, we're always being told we have to think for ourselves and be creative. Hegel has exactly the opposite view. I think his worry is if you think for yourself, all you'll ever think is what you've got in your head. You'll never learn anything. You'll never be moved by the matter at hand. And Hegel thinks that that might be fine in many areas of our lives, but not in philosophy. In philosophy, where we want to discover the truth about thought and ultimately the truth about the world, we have to adopt the comportment of letting. We have to let thought, being determine itself in our own thinking. And I would say, A, this is not a matter of rhetoric. He actually means it. And secondly, this is not a peripheral feature of speculative thought, but it lies at its very core. This is the distinctive method of philosophy and logic as far as Hegel's concerned, to let its content, pure being, hold sway. Now, there's another passage I want to read to you because it injects a word that's very important and that we don't normally associate with Hegel, and it comes at the end of this passage. Philosophical thinking proceeds analytically in that it simply takes up its object, the idea. That's a technical term that you don't need to worry about at the minute. It means reason. and lets it go its own way, dieselbe gewähren lässt, while it simply watches the movement and development of it, so to speak. To this extent, philosophizing is wholly passive. Now, it's that word passive that I think is interesting, because we tend to think of Hegel with Fichte, with Marx, with Nietzsche as being advocates of activity. And that is true in some respects. Hegel is an advocate of activity. But in philosophy, passivity is what is crucial. We've got to let thought unfold itself. And that's not easy. In fact, it's one of the hardest things to be able to do. So we have to be active in our passivity. And there are two ways in which we are active. One is simply holding ourselves to being passive, which is harder work than one thinks, because inevitably when one reads Hegel or any philosopher, there are little voices popping up in one's head that say, but surely Wittgenstein said, Aristotle said, but
Yes.
this can't be true. So that's one thought. But there's another aspect. So that's one respect in which we're active. We have to discipline ourselves. But there's another respect in which we're active. And this is, Hegel thinks that we have to actually render explicit what is implicit in a category. So being will move our thinking, but we have to render explicit what's implicit in being in order to let ourselves be moved by what's implicit in being. And this will be true with every category we look at. Hegel himself puts the point like this. He says, the whole course of philosophizing is nothing else but the mere positing of what is already contained in a concept. So when we're thinking of the method of philosophy, as Hegel conceives it, on the one hand, we have to be passive, let thought unfold. But on the other hand, we have to actively render explicit what's implicit in different categories in order to enable ourselves to be passively moved by what's implicit in a category. And that itself is hard work. And so as you go through the logic, we have to identify, first of all, what a category is explicitly, and then what's implicit in that explicit category. And then we have to make explicit what's implicit in that explicit category. And that, Hegel thinks, moves us on to another category. So there is a strong element of activity and hard work involved in simply watching the movement, so to speak, of being. Yeah, so you don't think of yourselves as just sort of lying back and sort of letting it happen. It's not like watching a film. But what is crucial is the activity we engage in isn't the normal kind of activity we associate with philosophy. If you think of, in partly Descartes and the objections he puts out, or something like Mill's on liberty, where you put forward an idea and then you raise objections and then you consider the objections and then you come to some conclusion. The idea there is that philosophy is something that we're doing. We are the ones doing philosophy.
Yeah.
Ultimately, for Hegel, that's not the case.
Yeah.
We're not the ones doing philosophy. We are enabling thought to think itself through us. Okay, so that's just a bit of an introduction to what Hegel's about. There's obviously much more. So I just want to say, just to end with, a little bit about what we're going to look at in this course. We have 2 evenings, so clearly we can't cover a lot, but talking with Johannes, we together have chosen some sections that we think will be of interest to everybody. So first of all, there is a short essay that at the start of Hegel's logic called "With What Must Science Begin?"
Mm-hmm.
And this section considers how philosophy must begin, without, as it were, always already having begun. That is, without knowing in advance what it is that we will discover.
Okay, I think he just dropped for some reason. Maybe due to the connection. He's right back. Okay.
Oh, sorry. I do apologize about that. I don't know what happened there.
You're back anyway, so.
Okay. Apologies. Let me go back to start this a little bit again then. So what are we going to look at in this course? The first part will be the section with what must science begin? And this is Hegel's thinking about the nature of beginning, and he considers Fichte's beginning and other beginnings. But this gives you the gist of what Hegel's got in mind. So this is from the Miller translation, if you have access to it, page 70, and it's about 6 lines down. Don't worry if you don't have it, because you will have access to this, I think, when we get to the actual course.
Yeah.
So Hegel writes, thus the beginning must be an absolute, or what is synonymous here, an abstract beginning. And so it may not presuppose anything, must not be mediated by anything, nor have a ground. Rather, it is to be itself the ground of the entire science. Consequently, it must be purely and simply an immediacy, or rather merely immediacy itself. Just as it cannot possess any determination relatively to anything else, so too it cannot contain within itself any determination, any content. For any such would be a distinguishing and an interrelationship of distinct moments, and consequently a mediation. The beginning, therefore, is pure being. Secondly, we'll consider the famous account of being, nothing, becoming. And this is where we will first encounter dialectic. Now, dialectic is a word that seeped into general discussion, and it's often used to describe some kind of relation between elements. One often talks about a dialectic between society and the individual. It's important to know that that's not how Hegel uses the word. Dialectic has quite a specific meaning for Hegel, and it is the process in which something turns into its opposite through simply being what it is. So because A is A, therefore through being A is not A. Does that violate the law of non-contradiction? Yes, I think it probably does. Should we presuppose the law of non-contradiction at the beginning of a presuppositionalist logic? No, we shouldn't. So if that's what being proves to be, if it proves to be nothing through being, then I'm afraid Hegel thinks that's what we have to think. Now, dialectic will take different forms as you go through the logic, but this is the place at which we first encounter it. And it's sort of where people really divide. Either they find this exhilarating and illuminating, or profoundly frustrating. And I think, it's understandable if people have either, and they may even have both reactions at the same time. But it's right at the beginning that you first encounter this. But I'm hoping also, if there's time, we'll look at the transition from becoming to determinate being, or Dasein. And this is important. I mean, intrinsically, it's important because it moves us on in the logic. But it also indicates that dialectic can take different forms, because the dialectic that gets us from becoming to Dasein is different from the one we see with being, nothing, and becoming. And I think that's instructive, that we see at work different forms of dialectic. In the second seminar, then we'll look at Hegel's account of finitude and his account of the so-called bad infinite and the true infinite. With finitude, we'll see that, unlike Spinoza, for example, Hegel doesn't think that being finite is simply being limited by something of the same kind. He thinks that being finite is bringing oneself to an end. So finite things die, as it were, simply through being alive. But Hegel thinks through finitude and the demise of finitude, there arise different forms of infinity. One of them is what he calls the bad infinite. The bad infinite is basically the infinite that is other than the finite, that lies beyond the finite, that transcends the finite. And Hegel thinks it's a bad infinite, not for any moral reasons, but because it's not truly infinite, because it has a limit in the finite itself. So one of the lessons then that comes out of Hegel's account of infinity is that true infinity does not transcend the realm of the finite. It is rather the process in which the finite themselves are moments. True infinity is a process in which finite things themselves participate. It's a process Hegel thinks is manifest in nature and in human history. At that point, I'm afraid, sadly, we'll have to stop the course. And at this point now, I am going to stop. So I just want to thank you for your interest and hope to see you if you've been intrigued by this little trailer for Hegel's Logic. Hope to see you on the first session on November the 25th. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen, do we have time for a couple of questions?
Absolutely. I'm not going to go anywhere. Yes, that's fine.
Okay, good.
Just going to have a quick drink, if that's all right.
Yes, take time. So, brief one here. Is knowledge required of Hegel's philosophy to attend the seminars?
No. I think, no. In fact, in some ways, and this is not meant to be cute by saying this, if the logic is meant to be presuppositionless, then obviously at the start, we know absolutely nothing about where it's going to go or what's going to happen after the logic and so on. So clearly, let me be realistic. If you know a little bit about Hegel, then you will have some idea of the kind of way he thinks. If you know a bit about Kant, for example, that might be helpful. But no, you do not have to know anything about Hegel's philosophy to attend the seminars. And I'll do my best to explain things as clearly as possible. And remember that, the teaching I do at the university, I mean, at some point, these students have got to encounter Hegel for the first time. Yeah. And for a long time, they did so through me. So you shouldn't worry about that. And let me also just say, in addition to this, if there are things that I say that are just, maybe go too quickly or too complicated, then I'm always happy to repeat them for anyone's benefit.
Excellent, thank you. Which book of Mr. Houlgate would be a good starting point to begin with Hegel's philosophy? I should say the opening of the Logic, but
yes,
or maybe the introduction.
It sort of depends. It depends sort of what you want. If you want an overview of Hegel, then I guess yes. I mean, the introduction to Hegel's Logic, Freedom, Truth, and History, that will situate Hegel. First of all, it talks about all parts of Hegel's philosophy, his phenomenology, his philosophy of nature, political philosophy, his aesthetics, which I happen to really love, because unlike Kant, Hegel has a lot of examples. So you can read what Hegel says and then go and, read a play or read a novel, and the philosophy of religion. On the logic, then maybe the opening of Hegel's Logic. I mean, I have a bigger book that I just published a few years ago called Hegel on Being. And I absolutely do not expect you to read all of that, because that's as long as Hegel's Logic is. But the opening few chapters might be helpful in talking about the project of the logic and how it relates to Kant and how the logic relates to the phenomenology.
Here's a question that has slightly more assumptive and more presuppositions. How much was Hegel's cryptic writing affected by the context of his times, and how much due to the nature of the content? I don't know. Cryptic, it's difficult, but not cryptic, I would say. But
well, I know what you mean. Let's start with the content, or let me sort of back up slightly. Hegel is very different from Kant, and indeed different from Adorno in the 20th century, in that he tries to use ordinary German vocabulary as much as possible. Now, I realize if we're reading it in English, that's not much help, but nonetheless, his task was to try and teach philosophy to speak German. And in that, he is following Fichte partly. So there is an attempt to try and show that the concepts that he's developing in the logic can be connected to ordinary words that we use in everyday language. So what makes Hegel's thought difficult isn't necessarily the vocabulary, although I have to say for an English-speaking audience, it can be the vocabulary too. But for a German-speaking audience, although Johannes perhaps ought to speak to this more than I should, I think the syntax is difficult. And this is connected to the fact that Hegel's philosophy doesn't always consist in ordinary judgments. I said before that Kant tends to think that when we think in judgments. We say this is that, a monad is a simple substance, or whatever philosophers say. Hegel's philosophy is more developmental. Ideas change and emerge, and some of Hegel's syntactical innovations try and enact that emergence in the actual sentences themselves. So that's part of the difficulty. The abstractness is no doubt part of the difficulty. There aren't many examples. And then some of the vocabulary, I think even for a German audience, is complicated. So he will, there's one word that comes up, which is sich anders werden, becoming other than oneself as a single word. So I think to go to the second part of your question, how much is to do with the nature of the content? I would say most of it is. I don't so much think that the problems are to do with the context of his times, except that Hölderlin famously wrote very long sentences, and Schelling could be difficult, and Kant could be difficult as well, but for different reasons. But there's something you haven't mentioned that might be relevant, and that is that, to begin with, Hegel had a reputation for not being a terribly clear lecturer. And I think he improved as the years went by. I mean, he can write very well. So if you read the preface to the Phenomenology, it has its difficult moments, but it also has some quite punchy and an elegant writing. So Hegel was capable of writing well, but there are moments in some of the Jena texts that are not so clear. So I think it's a little bit of Hegel's own awkwardness as a stylist, but then also the content. And also, I suppose, the other thing that one's got to think about here, and this is not meant to be an excuse, we're doing this on the internet. Okay, we've got all the technology. Hegel wrote the Logic, the first volume, in 1812. Yeah. He was, at that time, headmaster of a school. He just got married. There would be no electric lights. He would probably be standing up at a desk, writing with a quill pen, and he didn't have multiple copies. So there are material things to think about that meant that Hegel didn't have the luxury of being able to revise and perfect as I hope we do. So there are a number of things going into that. But you're right to acknowledge that the style is difficult. If you compare him to Schopenhauer or Nietzsche, for example, Hegel is difficult and at times impenetrable.
And he would also warn against just looking for the results, as it were. The way to.
The way is the process is crucial. Absolutely, the process is crucial. But I would say, obviously, different people, different commentators have different views. Yeah. And the Hegel world is a nice world to operate in that we all disagree with one another, but we all tend to get on with one another. I don't think that in 40 or however many years I've been doing this, that I've ever fallen out with anybody. We all get on, but we have very, very different views, because we all acknowledge how difficult it is. And the difficulty stems from exactly what you've identified. Even the experts, I can spend quite a long time poring over sentences, and then by the end of the day think, well, I'm not completely sure I know what's going on here, but I'll have a go. I'm hoping the material we look at won't be that bad. So don't worry.
Maren is in the course, the person who asked the question. So.
All right. Okay, good. Yes.
There'll be more opportunities. So Apeiron asks, what do you think of Trendelenburg's claim that Hegel's dialectic depends on intuition? For example, in a shift from being to nothing, but pure negation would yield only not being.
Well, I don't agree with that. I think Hegel's logic is a work of thinking. However, that thinking is identified by Hegel with intellectual intuition, in the sense that Hegel thinks that through thinking, we bring being to mind. That was something I didn't really talk about in my little introduction, because there was enough to pack in there anyway. So if you think of Kant, Kant thinks that we need two components in order to have cognition. We need sensuous intuition, need things to be given to us through the senses, and we need concepts in order to think of those things as objects. And if we took away the sensuous intuitions, then the most that our concepts would yield would be the possibility of something. So Kant's example of the $100, I can think of $100 and they're not there. I've just got the possibility of them. Hegel thinks that thought, when it is not abstract, one-sided, the thought of understanding as opposed to reason, is precisely what brings being to mind. So Hegel thinks when we think the category of something or of cause, we are thinking what it is to be something. And in that sense, he thinks that thought is intellectual intuition. It's not intuition if by that one means there isn't really a clear articulable logic that moves you through from one point to another. Hegel's logic can be explained. There was a book that I think it was the very first piece of work I ever published, which is a review of a book by Michael Rosen many years ago called Hegel's Dialectic and Its Criticism. And Rosen made exactly that point, that argument, that there isn't really an argument in a sense in Hegel's logic. It's sort of moved by some kind of intuition of dialectic. And I think that is just not true. And it's kind of not interesting either, because what we want to know is why this category moves to this category. I mean, the same thing that motivates any philosopher. Why should this be deemed to be true? What justifies this? That motivates Hegel. So I don't agree with Trendelenburg's claim that Hegel's dialectic depends on intuition in that sense. As we will see next time, it's also not true that the shift from being should really yield not being, and there are technical reasons why that is the case. Not being is a determination that comes up later in the logic and is more complicated and complex than pure being. Hegel thinks being vanishes into nothing, and nothing is just the absence of being. It's as simple as that. But we can talk about that when we get to look at the being nothing and becoming dialectic.
Yeah, just to point this out, thank you. Briefly, that the actual seminars will be not on YouTube and not in a webinar style, but Zoom seminars. You will be in a virtual space together with Stephen lecturing, and also, of course, then you can ask questions. You'll be quasi face to face.
Yes,
so,
and I hope I'll be able to see you as well, because at the moment, obviously, it's lovely seeing Johannes, but otherwise, it's Johannes and me surrounded by the black abyss.
Yes, the Black Mirror.
Yes.
So here's Dr. Ryan Hecker, whom you
yes, who I know, of course.
Yes, he's joining us as well. He asked a different question, but this he rephrased his question. How would Hegel have responded to Schelling's 1841 lecture critique of the possibility of a presuppositionlessness beginning of philosophy?
Well, Ryan, yes, we would. I mean, I have done an article on. I suppose that's my easy way out is to say I did an article many years ago on the late Hegel, the late Schelling's critique of Hegel. Okay, I think the problem is that Schelling, even before 1841, really, sort of in the 1830s as well, doesn't take Hegel seriously. I mean, I think this is a serial problem among post-Hegelians, and let's consider Schelling a post-Hegelian, that they know that Hegel talks about presuppositionlessness. But from Trendelenburg to Feuerbach to Schelling to Nietzsche to Heidegger to Gadamer to Deleuze to Derrida, well, Derrida is the one who gets closest to taking him seriously. They don't take it seriously, so they don't really know what even Hegel means. So I think Schelling's critique is twofold, as I understand it. It's partly that Hegel's so-called presuppositionalist logic has to make various presuppositions, particularly about existence, for example. And some of that is kind of obvious. Hegel wouldn't disagree with that, as I said before. I mean, there are presuppositions to presuppositionalist philosophy. The other critical point that Schelling makes, and perhaps more in the lectures on the history of philosophy, is that there isn't really the dialectic that Hegel thinks there is between being and nothing, because pure being is always already nothing in the first place. So nothing's vanishing, nothing's disappearing. And I think that is a simple mistake. So I think there are aspects of Schelling's critique of Hegel that are just a mistake, and other aspects in which it sort of depends exactly the kind of weight Schelling's giving to his critique. If he's simply pointing out that there are certain, if you like, existential presuppositions to doing presuppositionless logic, well, Hegel wouldn't have a problem with that. The question is to what extent those preconditions actually interfere in and guide the logic. Now, Hegel thinks they don't. Schelling, I think, thinks they do, because with Trendelenburg, Schelling thinks that concepts don't move. Whereas, and the beginning of the logic is a good example of that for Schelling. You need potencies, you need anticipations, you need the potential for all of the things that Hegel thinks, no, you don't need. The point about pure being is that it itself vanishes in being thought. It's not that our thought simply moves from A to B, but the concept itself vanishes in being thought. Now, that kind of movement inherent in a thought itself, a concept itself, I think Schelling rejects. And I guess I would push back on that. The other point on the Schelling, I think, is that from Hegel's point of view, Schelling looks like he's making his own assumptions about the relationship between existence and thinking, between the positive and the negative. So Schelling misses, for example, the parallel there is between the beginning of Hegel's logic and one of Schelling's own thoughts. So Schelling makes the distinction between what something is, which obviously we can articulate in concepts, and that it is, the das, the very that of things. Now, you can understand the being at the beginning of the logic to be precisely that. Pure being is not a what, it's the simple that, the das. But Schelling can't see that. So Schelling misses the extent to which there are actually certain points of connection between himself and Hegel. Anyway, I don't know if that'll help, but all I can say at the minute.
Here's a question from Harris, who's also already signed up for the course, by the way, which I think fits quite well here. Does Hegel regard bad infinity as a dialectical error?
No, I don't think so. It's a necessary category, and there are forms in nature and in human existence that exhibit the bad infinity. So no, that's a very good question. I think the dialectical error would be holding on to bad infinity as the ultimate truth about infinity. In fact, this is really true of all the categories. The error is not in the category, it's in regarding that category as being somehow exhaustive. So the bad infinity has two forms. It has the form of a simple beyond, there's the finite and the infinite, and then it has the form of what he calls the progress to infinity, where you go on and you go on. And Hegel actually thinks that progress to infinity is exhibited, for example, by time and space. It's exhibited by the series of numbers. It's exhibited by the sounds. And bad infinity is an interesting one. This would take a bit of explaining, but there's some sense that Hegel might regard light as a kind of naturalized bad infinite, in that he regards light as having, at least in its phenomenal form, we're not talking here about quantum mechanics, but in its phenomenal form, light has what Hegel calls a certain self-identity to it, but it stands over against the material things that it illuminates. And that's very close in structure to the bad infinite. And of course, for us, consciousness too. Consciousness, insofar as it regards itself as having an identity of its own over against the things that it knows, is an embodiment of bad infinity. So yeah, good question. And I would say no, bad infinity is not a dialectical error. It's a category that is embodied in various ways in nature and in human existence.
Maybe a final one, because you've been very gracious with your time now. Hegel said that he would rewrite the logic 70 times if he could. If the way Hegel proceeds is letting thought itself guide us, would it then lead to a different book each time?
Well, I hope not, because that would be an awful lot of work. No. So I think one's got to, I think there are different things to be said about this. Hegel makes a remark in the introduction to the logic, which makes it clear that he thinks the method, insofar as there is a method, as I've articulated it, he thinks that is the true method. And there's nothing, there isn't, if you like, a further way of thinking that is going to be more free, more self-critical than systematically suppositionalist thinking. So he thinks he's got that right. And of course, maybe that's the wrong way of putting it. He thinks that is the right way to think. I mean, I think Hegel's like Kant and a lot of these philosophers, and he doesn't think he owns this way of thinking. This is a way of thinking that he thinks we have to adopt. So he thinks the method is right. And clearly, I mean, as all philosophers do, unless they're being deliberately tentative, Hegel thinks his account of the categories is right too. However, in preparing the second edition of the Logic of Being, the first was published in 1812, and the second one Hegel was working on and revised just before he died. And so that was published in 1832. He made substantial revisions to the beginning of the logic, not the being, nothing, becoming stuff, that remained the same, but the part between that and the finite and the infinite is quite different. And so you can see that Hegel is not of the view that you just sit down and write it and it's all, fine. It's like Mozart, you just write it out, it's perfect. Hegel is well recognizes that we might have to work on things to improve the presentation of the material and to get the logic right. But of course, not everything in the logic is revised. There are many sections that Hegel's gone over and thinks, well, actually, that's right. So I don't think the simple fact of rewriting would necessarily lead to a different structure. It depends if in the course of rewriting Hegel, or then we, following Hegel, find some aspect of the logic that we think, well, actually, I thought that worked, but now I think about it, it doesn't quite work. As indeed, a mathematician would do, or people working in formal logic. Some proofs work and some don't work, and you might think they work at one point, and then you revise them. So no, there's no automatic sense that will be a different book each time. The presentation might be different, and you can see this, for example, in the difference between the greater logic and the lesser logic, the encyclopedia logic. There's a slight difference in presentation. But I think the content changes only if we, and I think we can say we rather than any given I, come to the judgment that that logic can be better understood. And I think I'm quite happy for that to be an open question. I mean, I'm not interested particularly in trying to come up with some kind of foolproof defense against any possible revision. I mean, why would you want to do that? Although a lot of philosophers, a lot of people reading Hegel often seem to want to think, well, have we got it now forever and ever and ever? And my sense, is we work on what we've got and we understand it as best we can. I've just completed this big book on Hegel on being. There were 2 points where I think there are corrections that could be made to Hegel's logic, where I've looked at the stuff and it just doesn't seem to me to work quite as it should do. I've suggested alternatives, but that's just 2 in a large book. Now, other people can read the book, read my book too, and then make other suggestions. So I think what Hegel would resist is the idea that the logic should change just as we move through time.
Yeah.
That I think in that sense, he thinks that what is being discovered is a timeless truth, although it comes to consciousness at a certain point in time. So what it is to be finite for Hegel is always that something brings itself to an end, and it always has been that.
Yeah.
But maybe it hasn't been fully understood in the context of the logic now. But
it's rendered itself more explicit with the
it's rendered itself more explicit now, yes. So I think when reading Hegel, focus on the logical necessity as much as you can. Try and ask yourself, is this logically necessary? If it is, well, then I guess we've got no option but to believe it. If it isn't, then the question is, how do we improve this? Unless you want to step back from the whole project and say, well, the whole project is misconceived. So does that mean we shouldn't be thinking without presuppositions? We should be thinking with presuppositions. And then do we really want to be doing that? Are we better off by simply throwing assertions at one another?
First
I think X, I think not X.
Yeah.
Or are we better off endeavoring to set aside our assumptions and begin from scratch?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stephen. And very good questions, I have to say.
Yeah, good.
Also,
thank you for the questions.
Yes. So I look forward to welcoming you all. Stephen, you're free to go. I'm going to go over the technical details now of the course.
Good. I've just got to find the button that says leave. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Johannes, for organizing this. Thank you for your questions. And I'll see you on the 25th. Yes. Okay. Bye-bye to all. Bye-bye.
Bye. So as Stephen just said, the first session will be on the 25th of November. And the second one will be on the 9th of December. These are Tuesdays, always from 7 to 9 p.m. UK time, which is, I think, 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern time if you're in the US. So let me just show you the enrollment page, which is this one here. So there's a link in the description of this video. If you're watching this live, sorry, I should be smaller and this should be bigger. So this is the link to enroll. We have, I think, about maybe 10 places or so left. We had a early enrollment started last week. You'll find all the details here, seminar dates. So what will happen is that very much as will happen today, you read the text, you come in, you listen to about 45 minutes of Stephen lecturing on the set reading, and followed by maybe 15 minutes or so question time with a bit of a break in between. And in the second hour, another lecture and more questions. So that will give you a chance to be in a classroom with Stephen Houlgate and read the logic together with him. And also, we'll ask you questions, take notes. We're going to record these sessions so you can come back to them later again. Just listen to those lectures again. They'll be available for you on Teachable, which is the platform that we use for these courses. So there'll be 2 of those sessions, as I said before, each of them officially 2 hours long. It's not unlikely that we might go over a bit. The owl of Minerva flies at dusk, so this is when Spirit will grace us with its presence there. If you are currently a student, feel free to take advantage of the student discount. You must provide a valid proof of current enrollment upon request. So someone will reach out to you and ask you for proof of enrollment after you enroll. And if you're not currently enrolled, then this is the tier for you right here. There are also payment plans for it. Now, we are going to use the Miller translation. If you read German, you should read this in German. If you only read English, read the Miller translation. We are linking to a website, the Marxist.org website, that has all kinds of texts on Hegel and by Hegel available in all sorts of languages. So you wouldn't have to get a PDF of the text yourself, but it's a good idea to go on one of those used book websites and just get a copy of the Miller translation, or maybe the Di Giovanni translation as well, which is the newer one. But the Miller translation, I think, is a bit better. So that's the one we're going to use for this one. And as I said, we're going to link to that. It's already linked, actually. Now I'm just maybe going to show you what this looks like on the inside. So So currently we have about 20 people enrolled, and if you'd like to join, now we have about 10 or so places left. Let me just show you what this looks like on the inside. So this is then the course. You'll find the Zoom link here, which I'm not going to open now, of course. So it links to this website here. Yeah, so you see what the set readings are, and you'll find the readings here if you just follow the link. There's also a couple of handouts that you can download with additional quotes from Hegel and Fichte and Schelling and others. So there's 2 handouts for the first seminar, and there's one handout for the second seminar. As I said before, as Stephen mentioned, we're going to focus on being, nothing, becoming, and with what must science begin, and then the good and the bad, infinite. And everything in between, of course, as well. As if you want to read further on in the logic on your own, you should come prepared with questions and raise those questions. As you can see, Stephen Houlgate is very generous with his time. So we agreed to half an hour. We've now spent an hour together. So I will assume that probably the sessions will be about 2.5 hours long. And if you can't make the whole 2 hours each week, that's fine. Just come in, for an hour and listen to the rest in the recording. That's absolutely no problem at all. And of course, you'll just retain the access to the recording. Now, I am not going to respond to any of the questions here that you raised, because that's for there's a couple more here. So I would invite anyone whose questions we weren't able to get, just for time reasons, to sign up, and of course everyone else as well. I'm very glad that Stephen has agreed to do this, and who knows, perhaps there will be more next year or in 2 years or so. But this is it for now. He is quite busy, so and I'm glad that we could actually get him to do 2 full lectures, as you would if you were a student at Warwick, which I was fortunate enough to be many years ago now. And it's not let go of me. So if Hegel is all about letting go, this has not let go of me yet. So again, there's a honorarium that we kindly ask you to pay to join the course. If you're a student, there's a student discount. There are payment plans on here as well. Payment plan for Houlgate lectures, payment plan for the student discount. And then you click enroll. I can see here here's the British spelling, here's the American spelling. You'll find loads of details on Houlgate's life work here. If you're interested in his books, I mentioned this book here before. He mentioned this as well. So this is really a good introductory book to get on Hegel anyways, regardless of whether you're joining the course or not. An introduction to Hegel, which comes highly recommended by Stephen Houlgate. And if you'd like to get deeper into the logic, I'd recommend the opening of Hegel's Science of Logic. Apart from that, I think Stephen said what was most important is that he takes very seriously presuppositionlessness for all the reasons given. And there is so especially when it comes to the so-called the notion of Hegelian dialectics. If you come and take this course, you'll walk away from this whenever you hear someone talking about Hegelian dialectics as being thesis, antithesis, synthesis, you'll know they have no idea what they're talking about. Couldn't be further from it. I mean, Hegel even ridicules this notion because he finds it in Fichte and finds it rather simplistic. So the Hegelian dialectics gets thrown around, especially on the internet, to no end, but it misses the point. And so, as Harris asked before, is there sort of an error? There is no error. That's not to say that the true and the false are the same, that there's always something false in the true, but know that the process of the concept rendering itself explicit renders also its otherness explicit. And I think where perhaps just to add a few things on what it is, I think Hegel actually achieves in the science of logic is to render explicit for the first time what it is that philosophy has actually always already been attempting to enable thought to say. So it's the first complete rendering explicit of thought. So the question is it true or false? Is it correct or incorrect? That's not the question. This is what thought, European thought, Occidental thought, Western thought, etc., thus far has been grappling with. And it's now rendering itself explicit. So Hegel is able to reel in, to bring in all the presuppositions of thought through presuppositionalist philosophy, not just working from first principles, etc., or assuming a sort of there's this ghost-like metaphysical entities swirling around somewhere in another world, or a one substance doing something somewhere. None of this has to be presupposed here. All right, so again, we have only a few places left. The time to enroll is now. We begin in 13 days on the 25th of November. We have a week off then in between, which gives you enough time to read on. That's why we chose those dates. And then we continue on December 9th, always from 7 to 9 p.m. UK time. That's 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to record all sessions and we're going to make them available to you indefinitely. So join the course now. Thank you so much for listening. Good night.